This video is going to spoil the entirety of Tears of the Kingdom. Hopefully you've done a good chunk of the game before you watch this video. If not, this is your first and only warning. Is Tears of the Kingdom a better game than Breath of the Wild? This is a question that I have struggled to answer a lot more than I expected. As I am writing this review, I have done all of the main quests, completed all of the shrines, got to all the light roots in the depths, found all of the sage's will in the sky, and found every old map and collected its loot. I didn't finish all of the side quests, but I think I did the most important ones. I didn't fill out the Hyrule Compendium, and I certainly did not find every Korok. Even after doing all of this, I still have a hard time answering the question. One thing I think almost all of us can agree on is that Tears of the Kingdom is not 6 years better than Breath of the Wild. Even if I try to be generous and give them a year off because of COVID, and if I go even further and say that Breath of the Wild really was ahead of its time by, let's say, a year, I would still say that Tears is not 4 years better than Breath of the Wild. I'll be honest with you guys, I think it's at most 2 years better, probably closer to a year and a half. I know some people are going to think I'm crazy for even asking this, but just hear me out, okay? I'll try to give the best answer I can in this video. This is my The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom review. There's so much to talk about in this game, but I think the best place to start is with the intro. Even though you have a lot of control over Link during this section, it's almost all cutscenes for 15 minutes straight, which is not that uncommon for Zelda to do, especially when it comes to the 3D games. Both Twilight Princess and Skyward Sword also had very cinematic opening sequences, and you can make an argument for Majora's Mask as well. This opening segment features the same Link in Zelda we know from the last game, confirming that this is indeed a sequel. Not that it really matters, however, as this is really the only time where it feels like one, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Here, we see our two protagonists exploring the depths below Hyrule Castle as they uncover some ancient Hyrulean history that has the princess go crazy over and her appointed knight not really giving a shit about it, as you would expect.
すごい。リンク、これは大発見です。
My favorite thing about this whole segment is the unsettling music that plays during it. It fits the atmosphere perfectly and really makes you feel like both of them probably shouldn't be here. The rest of the intro isn't too interesting. You just slowly walk with Zelda and make your way deeper and deeper into the catacombs. The real important stuff happens at the end of the intro. Long story short, Ganondorf is sealed here by a magical green arm which just suddenly falls off without any explanation really, freeing him from the seal. He then breaks the Master Sword in pieces, infects Link's right arm, and takes away all of his hearts and stamina because of course he does. He then decides to raise Hyrule Castle from the ground, which causes Link and Zelda to fall further into the void. Link is saved from the fall by the magical green arm who was holding Ganondorf in place, but unfortunately Zelda falls into the abyss. And that's the end of this little introduction. So far, the game seems promising enough. We have our silent protagonist Link, Zelda in trouble again, Ganondorf back from the dead being a badass, all of the classics. Nothing too crazy, but nothing completely stupid either, so we'll take it. After those events, you wake up alone, not really knowing where you are or how you got there, and see that the weird magical arm has replaced your right arm and got rid of Ganondorf's corruption. You then pick up your Master Sword, or what's left of it anyway, and then use it to get out of this place. Once you find your way outside, you realize you are now on a huge island high above in the sky. You then take your first leap of faith in a scene that tries really hard to top the first shot of the open world from Breath of the Wild, but I don't think it hits as hard this time around. I don't know, it feels more forced than anything, and the shot doesn't really show anything besides the area you're currently on. It wasn't like Breath of the Wild's sight on the castle and Death Mountain in the distance, so it feels like the game is just jerking off to itself more than anything. Anyway, this area is going to be the tutorial section of the game, basically like the Great Plateau was for Breath of the Wild. I know it's called the Great Sky Island, but I'm just going to refer to it as the Sky Plateau from now on. As you start going along your merry way, fighting your first couple of enemies, chopping down trees maybe, just dicking around and exploring your new surroundings, this is almost guaranteed to happen. Yes, not only is weapon durability back, but what's left of your Master Sword is breakable. If you've played Breath of the Wild before this game, you would instinctively expect the Master Sword to regenerate over time, but no, the sword just disappears from your inventory completely. I really wasn't sure of what was happening at that moment. I thought it might have been a bug even, but no, it really just disappears from your inventory and never comes back. I have no idea if I'm the only one who feels that way, but it just seems so wrong. Why make you start with it at all if it's going to break like that? I don't think it would have been game breaking at all to have a very weak unbreakable weapon for the tutorial area. It's weaker than every other weapon you can find on the Sky Plateau, twice as weak as a tree branch, so it's not like you're encouraged to use it. This idea comes from a concept called balancing, and as we've seen time and time again, it's a concept that Nintendo has a lot of trouble understanding. And as you may expect, it's no different in this game, unfortunately. Alright, back to the tutorial. Not too long after starting your exploration, one of the inhabitants of the plateau hands you the Purapad, which is the Tears of the Kingdom replacement for the Sheikah Slate. It's going to serve as your map in this game among other things, just like it did in the prequel. It doesn't use the abilities you learned during the tutorial this time around, as those are reserved for your new right arm. Speaking of the abilities, none of the ones from Breath of the Wild make a comeback. We get a completely new set. Ultrahand lets you move almost anything you want and allows you to attach it to other stuff. Fuse lets you attach almost any object to any weapon, shield, or arrow for various effects. And Ascend lets you go through the ceiling right above you and pop out on the other side. The last one you get is Recall, which lets you rewind time, but for only one specific object. All of these abilities are awesome, definitely more interesting than the previous four. You can use them in so many creative ways throughout the game, it's some really good stuff. There are other you can unlock as you progress, but more on those later. Oh, and you might be asking yourself, how do you obtain these abilities exactly? Well, kid, I'm glad you asked. It's by visiting the 4 shrines on the Sky Plateau, of course. Yes, shrines are also back in this game. I was absolutely convinced that they wouldn't be, seeing how many people complain about them, but alas, they are. I'm gonna go in details about shrines when the time is due. Let's finish talking about the Sky Plateau for now. At the end of this tutorial section, you get your Master Sword teleported to wherever Zelda ended up after falling into the abyss. This is a pretty big what the fuck moment because that sword just broke like 2 hours ago. How did Link just pull it out of his ass like that? Like I've mentioned earlier, the Sky Plateau would have been a perfect opportunity to have a permanent weak weapon for 3 reasons. 1, to let people get accustomed to the weapon durability. 2, to let people mess around with Fuse while still being able to fall back on that weapon if needed. 3, and obviously the most important one, to have this scene here make any sort of sense at all. This scene is crucial to the story too, so having it make sense is kind of a necessity. I really wish Nintendo would update this in the game, but I doubt it's ever going to happen. With that being done, We are now freed from the Sky Plateau, and just like with Breath of the Wild, we can now go wherever we want. You're nudged towards a specific area near Hyrule Castle before jumping off, however. This area is called Lookout Landing. It's sort of like a base or central hub to look after the rebuilding of the Kingdom of Hyrule. There, you can meet some familiar faces such as Robbie and Purah, the latter being the main quest giver throughout the game. You're given a small quest here which consists of a trip to Hyrule Castle and back, and only then you are finally given your paraglider. At that point, if you don't feel like you're playing Breath of the Wild again, you sure do now, as Spirit tasks you to go to the same 4 villages Impa told you to visit in that game with very similar objectives. As you'll see, almost all of the main quest feels like the exact same. Outside of the Sky Plateau, which is also directly copied from Breath of the Wild, you have similar memories you can find all over the map, which tell you what happened to Zelda instead of Link this time. More on those later. You also have the previously mentioned shrines all over the map. You have the same Ubisoft-style towers, which also give you an alternate way to return to the sky. And last and by all means least, Koroks are back, because of course they are, and there's even 100 more to find than last time. You probably encountered a couple of them already on the Sky Plateau by that point. I have no idea why they decided to bring those back. In a game where you can fuse weapons together, which in theory means you're going to need half the inventory space you normally would, what is their purpose? I don't even think I got to 200 and never felt like it mattered. After a while, I even started ignoring some of them completely. They should have just expanded the number of inventory slots to maybe 1.5 times the default one and do away with Koroks completely. Would the game really be worse without them? I doubt anyone would complain. Alright, Korok rant over. Let's get back to the main quest. I'm gonna talk about the 4 main objectives in the order Purah suggests them. First, we head up to Rito Village, which is caught in an eternal winter because of a storm above the village. You head up there with Teba's son, Tulin, to solve the issue. You climb up with him to the dungeon as you bounce from ship to ship, which was pretty long and not really challenging, but still fun and impressive to do. In the Eye of the Storm, you find the quote-unquote first dungeon in the game, the Wind Temple. Visually, this place looks awesome. I really like the atmosphere, and traversing it is a great visual spectacle. Mechanically, however, it's not very impressive. Even though it's not a divine beast, it functions exactly the same way, where you need to activate the 5 terminals to unlock the access to the boss. Instead of being able to move parts of the dungeon, which was for sure the most unique thing about the divine beasts, what you have instead is your companion's ability, which is required to activate the terminals. Tulin's ability lets him launch a wind current behind you, allowing you to glide further than normal for a second or two, which, as you might expect, is insanely useful. This dungeon might be fun to navigate, but it's not a difficult dungeon by any means. None of its puzzles are hard to solve, and it even reuses some of them, notably the icicle one. However, I can excuse the simpleness of this dungeon based on it being the one recommended first by Purah. The boss, Kolgera, I thought was an absolute blast. Yes, it's also very easy, but I had so much fun fighting it. I saw that most people shot arrows at it from underneath to snipe its weak points, but what I did was straight up dive through all of them head first. I did break one of its parts with a bomb barrel once, but I didn't have that many arrows on me at that time, and I found that method way lamer than just diving through it. This made the fight much more entertaining for me, and even though it's not really challenging by any means, it genuinely felt like a traditional Zelda boss. I also really liked how Teba handed Revali's bow to Tulin after the dungeon was done. That was pretty cool. I guess he just got it back from Link in between games at some point. All in all, I thought this section of the game was solid. Much better than Breath of the Wild's Rito section, that's for sure. Solid first dungeon, solid lead up to said dungeon, fun boss fight, and good conclusion. Sadly, it'll take a long time for the game to reach this height again. Next up, we have the Gorons, and oh my, is this part of the game disappointing. The plot here is by far the worst out of the four. Instead of having a problem based on the environment, we have evil rocks that turn Gorons lazy and addicted to eating them. What were they smoking when they came up with this? This evil rock has corrupted Yunobo, who now has his own mining corporation or something. Honestly, I didn't care much about the plot here, it was just really stupid. The rock also just evaporates when you finish the dungeon, which is just some video game logic pushed to its extreme. Anyway, Yunobo became evil from the rocks, or it might be his new luchador mask, I'm not sure. So you knock some sense into him, literally, in a really free boss fight, while listening to the absolute worst song in the game. Then you climb up Death Mountain with him with no real challenge at all. You fight another really easy boss on a plane, launching Yunobo at its heads, and then you dive inside Death Mountain into the depths to reach the Fire Temple. This is by far the most complicated dungeon to navigate. It has a bunch of railroads that you need to switch around to reach the terminals. You really need to study and understand your map to figure out how to reach them. Yunobo has the ability to be thrown like a bowling ball, which can triple up as a projectile, a source of fire, and a bomb replacement. It's a really neat ability overall, probably the second best after Tulin's, obviously. The dungeon's boss, Marbled Goma, is an alright boss. You have a lot of opportunities to use both Yunobo's abilities and recall in that fight. I thought it was pretty enjoyable for the most part. I didn't have as much fun as I did with Colgera, but it was good enough for a second boss. All in all, this part was pretty good gameplay-wise, but had the worst plot out of the four regions. It had higher highs than the retail section, but I would say it was a bit lower in quality overall, as its lows were much lower. The Zora section of the game was very much the opposite of what I just described. What is happening here is that some sludge is falling from the sky onto Zora's domain and is polluting its water. It can only be taken out by throwing water on it. You can use some of the materials you collected throughout the game, such as chew jellies and splash fruits, as a water source, which is pretty cool. You end up meeting Sidon again, who seems to be one of the 3 people hyped to see you again in the whole game. This pre-dungeon section is really good, on par with the Rito one. It has some creative riddles to solve and some really cool new locations we never saw in Breath of the Wild. Sidon, as you might expect, will be our companion for this adventure. Our friend here is going through a bit of a character arc, kinda similar to Tulin. Tulin was going against his father's orders in order to help us save his village, but Sidon eventually comes to accept his role as the new King Zora, as his father is now leaving his throne to him due to being on the verge of death. He doesn't think he's ready for the role though, which doesn't really feel like the Sidon I know from Breath of the Wild, but I digress. You also get a pretty simple mini-boss fight here, which is just a way to introduce you to Sidon's ability, which honestly just sucks. It forms a shield around you, which makes your next attack shoot water, and can also shield you from the next hit. It does keep you cool in hot temperatures too, which is a neat detail that I definitely appreciate, but it's probably the least useful out of all the abilities. It also takes way too long to charge back up, which can be really annoying at times. Just like with the Wind Temple, you also embark on a platform climbing gauntlet to reach the dungeon. There are 2 really great things about this part. The first one being the return of the Zora armor, which is used really well to go up these waterfalls while in midair. The second one is the use of lower gravity, which also shows up at other places in the sky and is always cool. Getting to the dungeon does take a while, but it was really enjoyable the whole way through. Too bad the following dungeon is the worst in the game though. If you've been following, you can already guess how it's called. You can probably figure out the first issue with this dungeon just by looking at it. It's a completely open area. Navigating the place and figuring it out is basically done on arrival. Even worse, there are only 4 terminals here. Why? I swear this dungeon feels more like an afterthought than anything else. The puzzles are pretty easy to figure out as well, the hardest one probably being using a bubble of water to lead the current to open this door, and it's not super hard to figure out. The boss here, Muktorok, is also the worst one in the game. Basically, you need to hit it with Sidon's water throw to stun it and then attack, which sounds very simple, but here's the catch. The cooldown for Sidon's ability is almost identical to the delay between the boss's attacks, which is far from being unmanageable in theory, but Sidon isn't always around you when you need him to be. Also, getting hit by the boss turns off Sidon's attacks, so I guess just don't get hit, you fucking pleb. The phase 2 of this boss also has it just consistently throw sludge all over the place all the time, which slows you down infinitely. I really have no idea how you're supposed to fight this thing without your materials and just Sidon's ability. If you can do it, you're a real gamer. Maybe I just suck balls at this fight, I don't know. So overall, this quest had a really good start, but a very lackluster finish, which as I said is the complete opposite of the Goron quest. Last but definitely not least, we have the Gerudo quest, which is pretty good all things considered. A never-ending sandstorm has engulfed the desert, and Gibdos are attacking the place. The residents have now relocated under Gerudo Town, to which you have to make your way in. Thankfully, this time, you don't have to dress up as a girl to go through the town, even after you beat the temple. You need to do a couple of things here before the dungeon. You meet up with Riju and get a quick tutorial on how to use her lightning ability, which is then put to the test when you have to defend the desert against a Gibdo attack, as they are weak to lightning. Basically, Riju's ability lets you summon a flashing area around her, which makes anything you shoot with an arrow in that area get hit by her lightning. The Gibdos are technically weak to any elemental attack, not just lightning, but using Riju's ability is the most efficient way to defeat them. Then, you do a pretty simple mirror puzzle to make the dungeon appear, the Lightning Temple. For some reason, you fight the boss of the dungeon, the Gibdo Queen, right here and there. Well, you don't fight her entirely, you only fight her until she gets to half health. I just really wonder what their intention was for doing this. I wasn't really excited or angry, I was just confused when that happened. I was wondering if you were going to fight the Gibdo King or something at the end of the dungeon, but no, you refight the Gibdo Queen. I get that Nintendo is trying out new things, and I respect it, but yeah, this ain't it. Anyway, the Gibdo Queen is probably the hardest dungeon boss in the game. It's pretty hard to hit and bring down consistently when using Riju's ability, but it's also not completely tedious to fight like Muktorok either, so it felt like a fair challenge overall. You also have the option to reflect light at it if you kept a mirror from the dungeon. It ended up being my second favorite dungeon boss after Colgera. The dungeon itself was also pretty solid. From what I've seen, it's most people's favorite, and it's not hard to see why. There's a first part of the dungeon that's a lot more linear than the others, which definitely feels more in line with classic Zelda. However, you do reach a point where you need to activate its terminals. Just like the Water Temple, there are only 4 of them, but I think I'm okay with it here. You do have this first linear part to compensate for it, and the puzzles to reach the terminals are a lot more thought out in this dungeon. I don't know if I'd get stumped if I had to do it again, but I do remember it being the one that took me the most brain power to figure out. Just like most people, it ended up being my favorite dungeon overall, and this whole Gerudo section is my second favorite after the Rito one. Who could have possibly predicted that the desert-themed dungeon in a Zelda game would be the best one, am I right? Once you beat each of the 4 dungeons, you'll have the ability to summon the champions' spirit like Pokemon wherever you are and use their abilities at will. It's a cool idea in theory, and these abilities are a lot more, let's say, reasonable compared to the broken ones from Breath of the Wild. How they work is you have to find the sage you want and press A when near them to call their power, which works fine in the overworld, but when you're in a smaller space like a cave, it's much more annoying to use. If you want to call Yunobo's ability to blow up a wall, for example, if the place is too small for every Pokemon to appear, then some of them will unsummon themselves and go back to their Pokeball, and if it happened to be Yunobo, you're gonna have to walk back to a larger area to make him spawn. Otherwise, you'll need to manually unsummon all of them because there's no quick select option for it, wait for them to come back, and then manually summon Yunobo again. That's by far the worst flaw about this system. What's cool about them though is that they can attack enemies when they're out, helping you out when you're fighting or just trying to get away. I think the goal was to circumvent the general lower durability of weapons in the game, which it does, I can't deny it. It's also kinda cool seeing your squad with you, but I understand why some people wouldn't like it. Alright, it's now time to go back to Hyrule Castle. Zelda is spotted by Purr and the others from Lookout Landing just standing there. Menacingly! And since our main objective is find Princess Zelda in this game, I guess that means mission accomplished. We now rush to Hyrule Castle and reach Zelda's location, but when we get there, she just vanishes and you get ambushed by some enemies. I hope you like this plot twist because it's used over and over until you reach the central room. Turns out this Zelda was just a fake one created by Ganondorf to bait you here. The Big G then sends a bunch of phantom Ganons at you in the hopes of taking you down, but the rest of the Avengers show up to help you fight. These new Phantom Ganon enemies are pretty fun to fight overall. It's one of the best new enemies added in Tears of the Kingdom for sure. There's a chance you've already fought one of them, but it's still a fun fight even if you have. Once the fight is over, you'll be surprised to see that the real Ganondorf doesn't show up here. He just gives you a spooky vision of what will happen if he defeats you though, which is pretty badass. It also means that the game's not over. From now on, we're not copying Breath of the Wild anymore. The remaining of the game is all OC. After that Hyrule Castle encounter, you're given 2 final quests by Purah, which to me were both the absolute best and the worst part of the game. The first quest is finding a 5th sage, which is someone you've probably already seen if you've watched some of the memories. It's this character right here. Honestly, she's so forgettable that you probably don't even remember her name. For those who really care, her name is Minoru, and yes, I had to Google it while writing the script. The way to finding the sage is through the Sky Islands engulfed in a thunderstorm. You can find her weird Zonai owl mask thing near a shrine on those islands. You can dissipate the storm through a quest that starts in Kakariko Village, or you can just do what I did and jump down in the thunderstorm from above and accidentally find your way to the shrine. In fact, I had already done this part of the game before the fight at Hyrule Castle. What you need to do here is fly the mask into the depths, place it on this statue mold, which then the sage tasks you to bring back the arms and legs of the statue. This is basically a 5th dungeon in disguise where, instead of just reaching the 4 terminals, you have to bring them back to the central statue. Without question, this is the worst part of the game. For every arm or leg you carry back to the statue, you need to go through a series of Ultrahand creation puzzles, which bring the game to an absolute crawl. creating stuff with Ultrahand takes time, and it can be somewhat annoying to make what you build work properly. And since the challenge of the puzzles is on such a small scale, it's basically just crossing a gap. It doesn't really feel rewarding to do so. Once you're done with all of this, the reconstructed statue will serve as a vessel for the spirit of the Zonai Sage, who apparently was just chilling in your Puripad. You then need to climb on the statue and slowly ride your way to a different place in the depths, and fuck this section. The thing is super awkward to move, is slower than Link on foot, and even takes batteries to use. There's a series of enemies you can fight on your way there, but honestly, fuck that. Just run past them, they're not worth fighting. To make things worse, the Zonai statue doesn't help you fight at all without good Zonai parts. It's slow, clunky, and barely does any damage. You eventually reach the Spirit Temple, which is just a boxing ring for a boss fight against another big construct statue, which is very simple once you understand what to do, but still just kind of bad overall because you have to fight it with your new shitty toy. This finally concludes this terrible section of the game. Your reward for all of this is being able to summon this toy at will, which does have its uses as you can attach some devices to it and have a fire source available to you at all times, but be careful as it can fucking hit you with them. It also looks incredibly goofy. I can't be the only one who thinks so. When you look at all your squad next to you and see this thing, it just looks so out of place compared to the other sages. I think I'm gonna skip this quest on my next playthrough, I'll think about it. Your final objective is to find the Master Sword, which I think is the best part of the main quest. Before we get into that, we need to talk about the story. If you want the short version, it's the same as Breath of the Wild, but replace Sheikah with Zonai, replace champions with sages, and replace Link's memories with Zelda's memories. Okay, I'm trolling a little bit, but what happened in the present is pretty much the same as in Breath of the Wild. What happened to Zelda is much more interesting, however. Let's go back to the beginning of the game for a sec. Remember when you were with Zelda, the moment when the arm fell off of Ganondorf? Well, there was a magical stone on it called a Secret Stone, which Zelda picked up. These stones are meant to enhance the magical abilities of the people who use them. That thing is the reason Zelda got separated from you. She got sent to the past due to her magical abilities overflowing, I guess, to the time of the foundation of Hyrule, where she meets its founders, Rauru the Zonai and Sonia. Before you ask, I have no idea where or when that is in the timeline. I haven't really thought about it too hard yet, but I know some people who are much more obsessed with that stuff than I am are gonna make videos about it, but it won't be me. Anyway, both Sonia and Rauru, as well as that last sage you rescued in the present, yeah, I forgot her name already and I'm too lazy to look it up again, possess a stone just like the one Zelda now has. In fact, it's the exact same stone Rauru has in this time period. I think it's a bit of a shame that Zelda doesn't seem more curious about this whole situation. I get that she's confused, but she clearly was shown to have a lot of interest for the history of Hyrule. But when meeting the actual founders of Hyrule themselves, she's just like, oh, okay, nice to meet you. I don't think it was too much to ask for a little emotion here. Anyway, during this time period, Ganondorf tries to fool Rauru into an alliance, but his real intentions are to conquer that kingdom. He ends up killing Sonia and stealing her secret stone, and uses it to turn himself into the almighty Demon King in an admittedly pretty badass scene. Rauru, with the help of 6 sages, one from each of the major Hyrule races, Zelda and the other, all equipped with their own secret stone, succeed in sealing the Demon King away. Rauru had to sacrifice himself to do so, however. Remember that green arm that replaced yours? Yeah, that's Roru's arm. His spirit also guides you on the Sky Plateau, just like the King of Hyrule did in Breath of the Wild, ironically enough. Kinda weird that his ghost form still has his right arm though. While it's definitely not the greatest story ever, it's not even one of the best Zelda stories, it was definitely more interesting than Breath of the Wild's. The stakes feel higher, the cutscenes are much better, and everything is more memorable for it. There's a final part to the story that I haven't mentioned yet, and it has to do with what happens when you get all the memories. Through watching them and learning what happened with Roru and Ganondorf, you also learn at some point that eating a secret stone turns you into an immortal dragon. It's not something that is talked about in lengths, just mentioned at some point and something you might not even pay that much attention to in the moment. Once you do collect all of the memories, the very first dragon you see in the game, the one seen from the Sky Plateau, drops a tear in Hyrule Field, helping you deduce that all of the memories are actually the tears of this dragon. Should they have named the game Tears of the Dragons? Probably not. With this final memory, you finally learn where the real Zelda is in the present. After the fight against Ganondorf, Zelda still had trouble figuring out why she ended up in the past. She could have easily just gone there on accident due to the secret stone, but she did believe she was sent there for a specific reason. Do you remember when the Master Sword disappears from your hands before leaving the Sky Plateau? Yeah, it ends up in Zelda's hands in the past at that very moment. With that, she believes her role is to restore the sword to its full strength for Link, so he can defeat the Demon King in the present. Her solution for that is to fucking eat her secret stone and turn herself into a dragon to engulf the Master Sword with magical light energy. It's not too hard to see coming at all, to be honest, but even then, this scene is so well done that I think it is a certified bruh moment. Zelda's words hit so hard that it can give you chills. However, seeing this will inevitably make you ask yourself, shouldn't we have seen these drawings in Breath of the Wild if this is what happened? Which I guess we'll never have an answer for. I hope I didn't ruin this scene for you with this. Okay, you now know that the Light Dragon has the Master Sword, but how exactly are you supposed to find it? There is a way, of course. It's by revisiting the Korok Forest, something the final sage tells you after the Spirit Temple. This time around, you can only access it from the depths, which I thought was a pretty cool idea. The Deku Tree has been affected by Ganondorf's malice in this game, now renamed the Gloom. To free him, you're gonna have to fight some Gloom Hands, which is a new enemy type that's pretty dang annoying to defeat as it moves faster than your default run speed. Once you defeat it though, there's a twist second phase, which is a Phantom Ganon fight. Remember when I said there's a chance you encountered one of these before Hyrule Castle? That's why. There are a couple of these Gloom Hands to find in the overworld. Anyway, after fighting it, the Deku Tree will be freed from the gloom. He will then thank you and help you locate the position of the Master Sword, specifying that it's moving in the air. You probably understand what that means now. You can now accurately find the Light Dragon. Doing this also lowers the height of the dragon apparently, making it easier to reach. Once you get there, you're gonna be surprised that you can actually land on dragons without getting destroyed in this game, which is a really cool change. You can now, at long last, pull the Master Sword from Zelda's forehead, which will require you to have 2 full bars of stamina. This is a moment in the game that I will never forget. It's one of the highlights, not just of the game, but of the whole series. And then this happens. Okay, so you're gonna tell me that from the time of the creation of Hyrule until now, Zelda has kept the Master Sword engulfed in the most lightest and most magicalest energy of all time ever, and it is also stated in this game that the Master Sword grows stronger over time when exposed to said magic. You're gonna tell me all of that and then have it be fucking breakable? Seriously? Why, Nintendo? Not only does it make absolutely zero sense story-wise, it doesn't even make sense gameplay-wise either. I know that weapons you find have a lower base damage value than in Breath of the Wild on average, but it's still a game where you can fuse weapons with monster parts that add over 50 bonus damage to them. You're gonna try to tell me that having a base 30 weapon that doesn't break is too much? No, I don't think it is. I know it doesn't show the attack power of the Master Sword in the menu, but I can guarantee you it does have 30 base power. If you really think it's too much, just make it impossible for you to fuse with it, and that would balance it out. While I'm at it, I guess it's a good segue to talk about the combat. It's the same as Breath of the Wild. So back to the main quest. Okay, I'll talk about the combat, but there's really not much to talk about. It really is basically the same, which means it has all of the same problems. You all know what those are too. There's the exact same amount of weapon styles as Breath of the Wild, and they still have the exact same moveset. No improvement at all has been made there. The Flurry Rush is as broken as ever, but they must have tweaked the timing window to trigger it, as it's even less reliable than it was before, believe it or not. Way too often, you don't get it when you feel like you should, and you get it when you feel like you shouldn't. Your weapons break a lot faster than they used to, since most of the weapons you can find in the game are rusted ones. This is basically just an excuse to force you to use the fuse system, and I guess it works because you'll have to if you don't want your weapons to break all the time. People keep saying that the combat improved greatly because they increased the enemy variety. Added to the Bokoblins, Moblins, Lizalfos, and Yigas, you now have bigger Bokoblins, Horriblins, Aerokudas, Like-Likes, Gibdos, which we already talked about, and the Constructs, who are just robot versions of Bokoblins, really. As far as mini-bosses go, Hinoxes, Lynels, Moldugas, and Stone Taluses also make a comeback, but there are now Froxes, which are unique to the depths, Gloomhands, which we talked about already, a new Battle Talus, Gleeoks with elemental variations, and a couple of King Gleeoks which use all three elements, and the Flux Constructs. This seems like a good list of new additions, but most of these new enemies are still fought exactly the same as the ones that were already in Breath of the Wild. The big Bokoblin could have just been a Moblin if the devs decided so, the Aerokudas die in one hit just like regular keys, and the Horriblins aren't a much better enemy to fight. In fact, they are way more annoying than fun because of how much they like to hang on the ceiling and throw rocks at you. I generally just avoided fighting them altogether when it was possible. They're not worth the trouble. This was also the case with Like-Likes for me. I just generally avoided fighting them. They can't even catch you anyway, they're a static enemy. You just need to wait for them to expose their weak points and attack it, which I guess is different from the other enemies in the game, so they have that going for them. Oh, I guess I forgot to mention trees. Yeah, those were pretty funny. This point also applies to the new mini-bosses. It's not because you put 2 or 3 Bokoblins on the Stone Talus that the fight is really different. It's still Bokoblins on the Stone Talus. The Froxes are just a combination of Stone Taluses and Hinoxes. You can shoot them in the eye to stun them and attack the rock parts on their back. You can also stun them with a bomb when they open their mouth, which is surprisingly often. They never cover or close their eye like the Hinoxes do, never spit the bomb back at you or anything creative like that. You can even bounce off of their tail after getting an opening and just stun them again mid-air and repeat the process. It's such a poorly designed fight overall. The Gloomhands and Gleeoks are, I would say, good additions to the game, but their fights just end up feeling more like a check on how many arrows you have than anything else. The Phantom Ganon enemy after taking out the Gloomhands is a pretty cool fight though. One of the best new enemies in the game, and it does drop some very good weapons when defeated. Lionel still remained the best fight overall, however, followed very closely by the Flux Construct, who I believe to be the best new mini-boss in the game. Even though there are so many of them everywhere, there are so many ways you can approach this fight in all of its phases that I never got bored fighting them. So mechanically, the combat is very similar. The changes were almost all related to aesthetics. Because of this, I'd say the enemy variety is still very low, which I think is more of a problem for this game than Breath of the Wild, since it's pretty obvious Nintendo wanted to make it a more combat-focused Zelda. There are way more enemy encounters in the overworld, and since combat is a lot more forced on you than in Breath of the Wild, the flaws of the combat system are going to stick out more here. One last point I need to talk about is how much pausing you do during combat, especially towards the end of the game where weapons last for like a single silver enemy. There was already some amount of problematic pausing when your weapons were breaking in the prequel, especially if you were carrying a lot of them and you were looking to equip a new one. But not only has it gotten worse here, you now also pause every time you want to fuse a material to an arrow. Sometimes you can spend over 30 seconds in the inventory because you don't always know what you want to fuse your arrows with, but you have no real reason not to fuse them with something. It can take a lot longer than expected just figuring out what you want to do. Having the Master Sword not break would solve some of these issues, but apparently Nintendo thought pausing over and over again when fighting was a good idea. I'll agree that combat also wasn't Breath of the Wild's strong suit, but it was definitely not the main focus of that game. Even though you have more regular enemy types, the best ones to fight are ironically the same ones you fought in Breath of the Wild. People were saying that Tears was a harder game, but it's probably easier overall due to all the ways you can break and cheese it. If you don't feel like interacting with the enemies, you can always just throw a Puff Shroom and sneak strike every enemy, which is of course very fair and balanced. Oh, and you can still eat the whole grocery store you're carrying whenever you want with no downside in the menu, which was something people brought up with Breath of the Wild that was never fixed. I don't really need to talk about the cooking, it's exactly the same except now with a nice recipe book. Thank God, I really needed to remember how to cook a single hearty radish. Alright, combat tangent over, let's get back to the main quest. Here we go, time to kick Ganondorf's ass. We finally get to the deepest of all depths below Hyrule Castle, which is crawling with some of the hardest enemies in the game. Has anyone really taken the time to fight all of these? Just run past them, they're not worth fighting. You end up making your way back to the first area of the game, the one you explored with Zelda at the beginning, which is a nice touch for atmosphere. I also really like how you can blow up the rocks and uncover the rest of the wall Zelda was losing her mind over. It depicts all of what she did in the past after the imprisoning war, which I think is really cool. I also like how you stumble across a single torch while descending, being the one Zelda was carrying at the beginning. I really appreciate little details like that in a game. Alright, you finally get to Ganondorf's lair, and if you thought you could avoid fighting these enemies you just ran past, well, the guy just throws wave after wave of them. Fortunately for you, the Avengers show up here again and help you take them on. All of the previous dungeon bosses show up after the regular enemies are defeated, and the champions take them on for you. If you didn't beat any of the dungeons from the main quest, you have to fight the bosses here back to back, which of course is exactly how it was done in Breath of the Wild. So you make your way to Ganondorf, and he's weirdly just waiting for you here. He could technically leave the place and destroy Hyrule like he showed you he would, but he just doesn't. At least in Breath of the Wild, there was a reason as to why Calamity Ganon didn't escape from Hyrule Castle, but here, there is none at all. You can't really say it's because he's building power or something super anime like that, because he turns back from his skeletal form to his Gerudo form right in front of you. He even ends up turning into his Demon King form during the fight, so what's he waiting for? Anyway, the fight itself is pretty good. It's a decent challenge if you didn't over-prepare. I like how he can flurry rush your attacks, which you then need to flurry rush back to get an opening. That was unexpected for sure. He also has different types of counterattacks that you need to pay attention to. It's not that complicated to do overall. If you've played any Souls game before Tears, it's going to be a piece of cake really, but it's still a fun sword fight. It's been over 10 years since we've had a sword fight like that in the series, so it's refreshing to see. And thank fucking God, if you found the Master Sword before coming here, it will become unbreakable for this fight. I was so happy to see this, and I bet anything I'm far from being the only one. Maybe the fight just feels better than it really is because you're not pausing every 30 seconds, but I don't care, I had a good time. Special mentions to Ganondorf's health bar when he turns into the Demon King, that made me chuckle. After you defeat him, he eats his secret stone out of desperation and turns himself into the Demon Dragon. My man was starving down here apparently as he eats his whole fucking forearm. He carries you in his mouth all the way in the sky in his new dragon form, but in a moment you probably already saw coming if you already have the Master Sword, Zelda, the Princess of Dragons, comes to save the day. If you don't have the Master Sword at this point, the game just gives it to you before this final battle. I gotta ask though, aren't you supposed to lose yourself when turning into an immortal dragon? So how can Zelda know to help you out here? Whatever, I'm willing to forgive this just because of this kick-ass final battle. The fight is similar to the Dark Beast Ganon fight in Breath of the Wild, but the scenery is much cooler and way more epic, and what I think is the best music in the game is playing during that moment. It kinda sucks that it's just a remake of the main theme, but I'm willing to let it slide here just because of how good that song is. It mixes the main theme with the Dragon song and Ganon's theme beautifully. As far as gameplay goes, it's a very easy fight. In fact, it's barely a fight. You just glide down to its weak spots 5 times and hit them with barely any resistance. The dragon is apparently shooting projectiles at Link, but he's probably not even aiming at all. But it doesn't matter, this ending was awesome. Once you're done, Rauru and Sonia's ghost magically appear and turn Zelda back into a Hylian. I have no idea how that's even possible. How in the bloody hell are they able to do that? You were guiding me on the Sky Plateau, Rauru. You said you used the last of your powers to help me there, you lying asshole. I could have used your help against that Ganondorf guy. You already beat him once, so why can't you help me? This is Pokemon the first movie levels of bullshit where the Pokemon turn Ash back to life with their tears. This is just personally, but I do think it ruins Zelda's sacrifice to have her turn back into a Hylian that easily. It just makes the ending feel a lot cheesier than it should. In my eyes, it would have been a perfect chronological ending to the series. We go from Skyward Sword all the way to Tears of the Kingdom. Since Zelda is supposed to have lived all the way from the beginning to the end of the series, this could really be called The Legend of Zelda. You could still keep making games in between those two, but Nintendo probably doesn't want to close off possibilities for future games. Also, I'm not really a fan of this ending sequence. Catching Zelda just didn't hit me as hard as I would have liked. Zelda and Link don't even seem that happy to see each other again, and if they don't seem to care, why should I? And this goes without saying, but I also didn't really care about the final cutscene. It's just a way to see the 5th stage also make her farewell. And this concludes the main quest. So, was it better than Breath of the Wild? Overall, I would say yes. The story was more interesting with more memorable moments. It's not really the same type of story, as this one is more narrative focused and the previous one was definitely more character focused, which makes them harder to compare in terms of which is technically better. The gameplay was generally the same, maybe a bit better on average, as its highs were definitely higher, but it had its horrible lows that Breath of the Wild just didn't have. Breath of the Wild's worst moments, like the Rito questline or its bosses, were simply mediocre or unimpressive. The worst segments of Tears of the Kingdom are exhausting and even frustrating at times. I'm gonna give the edge to Tears nonetheless because of its higher highs. I think it left a bigger impact on me overall, mainly due to the whole Master Sword questline. I think I've been fairly neutral so far in this video. I've talked about stuff the game does better and stuff the game does worse than its prequel. Now, I want to talk about something Tears definitely does better, which is the side quests. I didn't finish all of them, of course, and I don't think I ever will, but the ones I've done were a lot more memorable this time around. I remember almost none of the side quests of Breath of the Wild. I can only think of the Terry Town one and building your own house. That's pretty much it. This time, I remember Madison's story, all of the ones from the Lucky Clover Gazette, mainly because I got the froggy armor out of them. Getting access to the Great Fairies was also a lot more involved. I don't think it was that great, all things considered, but still something I'm going to remember doing. I remember all of the ones at Typhlow Ruins, and the Bring Peace to X area ones. Rebuilding Laurelin Village was also good, so was restoring the eyes of the Bargainer statue. That one even gives you a heart container, probably making it the most important side quest by default. Restoring the different goddess statues at the 3 fountains was cool. The mayoral election in Hateno Village was very unique, but my favorite one has to be infiltrating the Yiga clan hideout and doing their trials. You can even get the Earth Scroll out of doing those, which is the launching attack the bigger Yiga members can do. Even though it's not a very good attack, it's still a nice addition to the game, and I really wish we had more loot like that to find. Not all of them are good, of course. Taking a picture on all of the flower-shaped sky islands isn't very interesting, and gathering all of the different balls in Gerudo Town was the biggest waste of time I've ever seen. Colton's wish to become a Satori will stay only a wish, as I'm not going to collect 147 Booble Gems for it. I also won't be finding all 58 wells anytime soon, and I'm not going to help Addison hold his dumbass sign in place 81 times. It might have its stinkers, but most of these side quests are still better than basically all of the ones in Breath of the Wild, aside from the 2 I've mentioned, which I would say are on the same level. So, the main quest has been improved, the side quests have been improved, combat is the same but with some more enemies. It didn't fix all of the issues of Breath of the Wild, but Tears of the Kingdom has got to be an obvious upgrade, right? Well, that's the thing. Everything else is worse. Yes, the overworld is worse, the shrines are worse, and honestly, I think the music is generally worse. Let's start with the shrines. At first, I thought they were a clear improvement on the ones in Breath of the Wild, but what I didn't know is that the ones you do near Central Hyrule are probably the best in the game. You have other decent ones, and a few of them are pretty good, yes, but outside of that, they are an absolute letdown. There are 152 shrines in the game, and after doing all of them, I can remember 4 off the top of my head. For those of you who played Tears of the Kingdom and did all of the shrines, how many do you really remember that well? If I really start thinking about them, I can probably remember somewhere around 10, which is still far, far, far from the total number of shrines in the game. Just off the top of my head, I can remember way more shrines in Breath of the Wild than in Tears of the Kingdom. Don't believe me? Let's start with Trial of Power. It was a shrine where you use boulders to open a bunch of doors in a row. You use every single one of the Sheikah Slate's ability in that shrine, and it even includes motion controls. You don't remember that one? How about Blue Flame, where you carry a flame from one side of the shrine to the other with various obstacles? Can you seriously tell me that a single shrine in Tears of the Kingdom reaches that level of quality? Twin Memories, how about that one? Or those ones, should I say. They're the ones at the top of dueling peaks where you need to remember what you saw in the other. That was a really cool concept. You obviously won't remember the exact combinations in each shrine, but you'll remember the idea because it was unique to those two shrines. Another really good shrine was the Winding Route, which uses the paraglider to navigate wind currents beautifully. Sure, it's not as good as the others I just mentioned, but you had to make it appear first by finishing the Recital at Warbler's Nest quest. Okay, it's not the most fun shrine quest in the game, but it's still something you're going to remember doing. In fact, I'd say the most memorable shrines in that game are the ones in which you do a shrine quest to open them. Remember the Thunder Plateau, where you brought the 4 orbs to the statue? Or the 7 heroines? Same concept but for the Gerudo region? I really enjoyed doing this one just for the sheer scale of these statues. What about the Shrouded Shrine in the Typhlo Ruins? That was pretty memorable, wasn't it? Saving Private Nadra, remember that one? That's my favorite shrine in the game, by the way. Of course, you have Eventide Island, which is considered by many to be the best shrine in the game. Nintendo seemed to agree, so they decided to separate it into 15 Proving Ground Shrine for Tears of the Kingdom. You know how people were saying that spreading out the dungeon content of 5 to 10 dungeons across 120 shrines was a bad idea because it makes each of them less memorable? Yeah, they doubled down on that concept apparently. On that same line of thought, Nintendo thought that tutorials were such good content that they made shrines out of them. 7 to be precise. They clearly couldn't have made one single shrine teaching you everything you need to know, definitely not. The 10 examples I gave from Breath of the Wild are still far from the total 120 shrines, and I could definitely list a lot more than those 10 just off the top of my head, but I wanted to go with stuff people had a good chance of remembering. So, what do the shrine quests even look like in Tears? Out of the 31, 25 of them are a Bring the Crystal to Papa type quest. For reference, that's more than the number of combat shrines in Breath of the Wild. There's only one of those I remember well, and it's the one where you drop the crystal from the sky into Lake Hylia, and was the only one I enjoyed doing. If those shrines were only found in the sky, it still wouldn't make them good, but at least there would be sort of a challenge in bringing the crystal back to the shrine. There are no excuses for having those on the surface level though. The other quests are barely worth mentioning, but let's do it anyway. There's Dying to Find It, which is just a simple time of day shadow puzzle, which were some of the worst shrine quests in Breath of the Wild. There's Keys Born of Water, which is completed by placing different sizes of ice platforms on the altars, which means you have to wait for the platforms to melt in the sun for them to be small enough. Fantastic gameplay right there. In Breath of the Wild, when you had challenges involving ice, the challenge was to not having it melt, because that's an actual challenge. Here, you just wait in the sun for the ice to melt, and that's worth a shrine apparently, probably to reward your patience. The last one I'll mention is Legend of the Soaring Spear, which is done simply by standing on a pedestal, fusing a spear with a key swing, and throwing it into a hole. That's it, that's the whole quest. All 3 of them are blessing shrines, which means they're a free shrine with no puzzle at all. There are 3 other shrines tied to quests in the game, but you can easily just stumble across them without ever getting the quest. One of them was a normal shrine, one of them was one of the 15 Proving Ground shrines, and one of them was a blessing shrine, and the easiest to find randomly out of those 3 by far. Do you want to know how many blessing shrines there are in the game? I don't think you're ready for that one. I'll give you a hint. It's more than a number of Proving Ground shrines, tutorial shrines, and combat shrines in Breath of the Wild combined. You ready? 52. And yes, I'm counting the one that trolls you and makes you light 2 extra candles. That's about a third of the shrines. I'm not going to do a full breakdown of them, but of course I know that some of them are tied to different quests, including an overworld puzzle or a minigame, but a good chunk of them are just hanging around in caves with no puzzle whatsoever, just a million rock walls to destroy before reaching them. I'm not going to pretend that Breath of the Wild didn't have some terrible shrines or empty blessing shrines, because of course it did. However, the overall quality felt more balanced. Most of them were just okay, some of them were great, and some were bad. I felt that most of the shrines and tiers were either forgettable or just simply bad. They're almost always about creating stuff with Ultrahand anyway, which ends up being super simple and repetitive. You can usually figure out what you need to do right when you enter the place. It simply takes forever to do them because Ultrahand takes forever to use. You also have to use Ascend here and there, but it's also pretty obvious when you have to. I really think shrines shouldn't have come back in this game. And that rounds up what I had to say about shrines. Let's move on to the overworld. Surprisingly enough, unlike most people, I didn't have an issue with Tears reusing the map of its prequel. It's funny because I distinctively remember people praising A Link Between Worlds when it was announced that it would be in the same world as A Link to the Past, and now these same people are saying that it's a problem with Tears. As for me, I didn't really have a problem with it, and I still don't after playing the game. The overworld map was changed significantly. A bunch of caves were added, the villages have changed, there's a sky and an underworld part, etc. I'll go into more details about the surface level later, but let's talk about the sky at first, as it was one of the main selling points for Tears of the Kingdom. It honestly just feels like an excuse to put more shrines and Korok seeds than anything else. Sure, there are some boss battle, there's some unique loot that you can find, mainly the Sage's Wills and the old maps I mentioned at the beginning of the video, but there's really not that much content up there, and most of what you find is just copy-pasted everywhere. Outside of the Sky Plateau, there's only really one other unique place, which is the Thunderhead Isles required for the main quest. There's another small unique island that only exists for one shrine. There's a diving minigame you can do at 3 different places. There are the labyrinths that were expanded on from Breath of the Wild, but they suck. If you liked activating terminals and dungeons, you might enjoy them, I guess. They use the same concept, but without any puzzle at all. You just glide to the terminals and activate them. Plus, you first have to do the ground version of the maze before doing the sky one, which simply consists of following the acorns to the end with no challenge whatsoever. I don't even remember if there's one enemy in any of the grounded mazes. After the sky one, you dive all the way to the depths to fight another flux construct, and your prize for all of this is a piece of armor you're never going to wear. And that's it, really. I just summed up everything you can do in the sky in a couple of sentences. I hope you didn't expect to see a unique construct village, some different biomes, because Nintendo had other priorities. There are 2 of the main dungeons in the sky, but I don't really think they count. Last thing you can mention is that you can find your Zonai devices to help you build your vehicles and stuff here. These are given to you via gacha machines spread mainly across the Sky Islands, for which the currency is Zonai charges. You get that collectible by defeating the new construct robot enemies. Sorry, I really wish I could talk about the Sky more, but there's really nothing to talk about. It's quite the feat that Nintendo, for the 4th time in the series, haven't been able to make the Sky an interesting place. Alright, now let's talk about the depths. I've alluded to it a couple of times already, it's finally time to talk about it. At first, it was my favorite thing ever. I loved how it felt to be completely in the dark, and I love how challenging navigating the place was because of it. These ghost soldiers holding weapons were also really cool, the various statues were very intriguing, and the glue mechanic, removing some of your hearts you can heal, was one of my favorite things about the place. There's an actual consequence to getting hit this time around, and it makes you unable to heal infinitely in the pause menu. This is good because fighting is what you're going to be doing most of the time here. The only way to restore hearts taken out by the gloom is either by warping out of the place completely, or by lighting up one of the light roots, which are the warp points of the depths. That is, until you start cooking Sunderlion and ruin it, but whatever. Another thing I really like about the depths, which is something I haven't seen that many people mention, the light roots are in the same place as the shrines on the surface. I've heard it's written somewhere in the game, but I guess I just missed it. I only figured it out when I had almost all of them. I kinda wish people had to discover it on their own like I did, instead of it being spelled out to you like that, but whatever. The depths is also the place where you find the loot from the old maps, but most of that loot is pretty useless. They're basically the armor sets that were behind amiibos in Breath of the Wild and are really just there for completion's sake, as there's really no reason to ever wear those armor sets other than aesthetics. Oh, there are also unique weapons to find from those old maps, but since weapons break, it's barely worth mentioning. There's also a quest line all throughout the depths that's somehow not part of the main quest, even though it should be, as completing it lets you know exactly where to find Ganondorf. Even though it's pretty obvious where he is, you still technically learn it here. The quest in question revolves around Master Koga of the Yiga clan, and fighting him all over the place. It's basically a series of boss fights that are decent overall, some are definitely better than others. Before the first of these fights, you unlock the Autobuild ability, which speeds up the process of creating your vehicles and also allows you to materialize some parts out of the ether at the cost of Zonaite, which is a mineral that you can only find here in the depths. You can also unlock some mines with this quest, from which you can buy crystallized charges by trading in some of that Zonaite. There are other methods of collecting crystallized charges, but the most efficient one is by defeating the dungeon boss rematches in the depths. Funny side story, I got so spooked when I saw Colgera again in the distance, I just couldn't believe that it was real. It was a similar feeling to seeing my first dragon in Breath of the Wild. Anyway, these crystallized charges can then be traded to a specific construct near Lookout Landing to upgrade your battery life permanently, allowing you to use the Zonai devices for longer periods of time. There's other somewhat meaningless stuff to find here in the depths, it's not really worth mentioning, I've covered the essentials. As I said earlier, it's basically a place to fight more enemies and farm Zonite and Puff Shrooms. However, because of all the issues with the combat system, having a place that exists almost solely for fighting is not really interesting. I wish the depths had its own enemy types instead of reskinned versions of the one you already know. Like I mentioned earlier, there are Froxes who are uniquely found here, and there are smaller versions who can eat the Bright Bloom seeds you use to light your way when exploring, which is pretty cool, but I don't think it's enough. The depths were interesting to me for the challenge of traversing the place in the dark, but at some point it started getting old. The best part about it was how the light roots and the shrines were connected, meaning one can help you find the other. On that note, if every shrine is supposed to be connected to a light root, how is it possible for some of them to be in the sky? Bet you didn't think about that one, huh? Most of the new things added to the overworld are on the surface level in the end, specifically with all of its caves. It's still the best area to explore overall, but the exploration has a huge problem. It's not fun. I can think of 2 points essential to make an open world game work. It needs at least one of the two. You either need your world to be fun to traverse, or you need the loot you find to be worth your time. Part of what made Breath of the Wild work as an open world game came from the challenge of traversing its world by climbing and gliding. Climbing to a higher area, spotting some interesting thing in the distance, and then gliding to it was fun because you were rewarded for the time you took to climb that mountain. The world ended up being so inviting to explore because of it, even if the rewards were not really that interesting. One of the points was respected. Unfortunately, neither of the two are in tiers. There's basically zero challenge in exploring the world. You just warp somewhere in the sky, spot a shrine or a tower, and glide to it without any trouble whatsoever. It's literally just holding up the whole time, and you repeat the process over and over and over. Since getting to a higher spot in the sky takes absolutely no effort at all, the satisfaction of finding the shrines is therefore absent. I even found both Hateno and Kakariko Village by complete accident by doing this. I didn't even know that's where I was going until I landed there. However, the main point of interests from Breath of the Wild all got their own little touch from the developers. For example, Link's old house in Hateno Village is now named Zelda's house. I have no clue if she stole your house or if she lives together with Link, but I do think it's pretty funny. Exploring the well at the back of the house reveals to you how to get the official tunic of the game, now called the Champion's Leathers, which just like in Breath of the Wild, is the best single armor piece in the game once fully upgraded. However, I have to ask, if it was supposed to be a gift from Zelda to Link later on, why the fuck is he wearing it during the intro? Wouldn't it make way more sense for him to be wearing his Breath of the Wild tunic during this part? I can't be the only one who noticed this plot hole. Speaking of armors, the loot has barely improved since the last game, certainly not enough to compensate for the boredom of traversing the world. Outside of the Hylian shield, weapons, bows, and shields are certainly not interesting because of how fast they break, so the only loot worth getting is the different armor sets. However, you're almost never going to wear more than a couple of armor sets in your playthrough. I didn't find all of them, but I'm pretty sure all of the ones from Breath of the Wild are back. Like I mentioned earlier, there are the legacy armor sets, but they don't really matter. Their use is almost purely for aesthetics. The climbing gear is more useless than ever, as you can just make flying vehicles or glide from the sky to anywhere you want. I never even thought about it while playing the game. You do have new armor sets, but most of them end up being a lot less useful than you would think at first. You have the Froggy set that lets you climb stuff normally in the rain, but you only get it after a series of side quests at every stable, so it becomes pretty useless by that point. Plus, again, you can just fly anywhere now. You have the wingsuit, which allows you to move faster while gliding down, but you get it after 3 minigames in the sky, and those minigames are really the only time where you would really need it, ironically. If you don't find it as early as possible, when you have very low battery life and stamina, and don't have most of the shrines and towers active, it's not going to be that useful to you. There's the miner set that lights up the area around you, which you would think is useful for the depths, but since the outfit is found in the depths anyway, it's a bit counterproductive. Also, look at this drip, man. It looks like Slipknot making a Christmas album. Some pieces of armor are nice to find though. You can turn into a Zonai version of Link with the Ancient Heroes aspect, which is your reward for completing every shrine. It's a pretty good armor set too. You can also find your old tunic from Breath of the Wild, now called the Tunic of Memories, so now you can decide which official look you prefer between the two. There's the Yiga outfit, useful for infiltrating their hideouts. Outside of that, none of the other armor sets are really that interesting. There's the depth set that makes you more resistant to gloom, but it looks cooler than it is useful in practice. And finally, there's the Mystic Armor set, which makes you lose rupees instead of taking damage, which of course is completely useless. You'd rather keep your rupees and instead eat from the whole grocery store you're carrying to heal off damage, or just not fight at all, since it's not really worth the trouble most of the time. To make things worse, you can't even upgrade this armor set anyway. What a garbage armor. Apparently they thought that losing rupees instead of taking damage was too broken, but they felt like puff shrooms were okay? I don't even know, man. You get this last armor set by giving Booble Gems to Kilton's brother, Colton. This is a new collectible that you get by exploring caves, killing the Booble frogs in them. There's one in every single cave. However, the only thing you really get out of collecting Booble Gems are the monster armors you bought from Kilton in Breath of the Wild, which means it's pretty much a waste of time. The other new armor pieces are not even worth mentioning. So overall, I think the world is a lot less fun to explore for these reasons, and is to me a clear step down from Breath of the Wild despite being over twice the size. Okay, so that covers pretty much all of the game. We talked about the tutorial, the main quest, the combat, the story, the side quests, the shrines, and the overworld. If you've listened to this video from the beginning, you can see why, to me, deciding which game is better is much harder than it would seem. To most people, it's really going to come down to what they prefer. If you want a more involved story, a world with a truckload of content, some sandbox element with which you can fuck around for hours, then Tears is the better game. If you prefer a more replayable game, simpler gameplay overall with a lot more memorable moments, a more memorable world, less combat focused, and I'd say a lot more chill, then Breath of the Wild is the better game. I've tried to be as fair as I could to both games. It's pretty much impossible to be entirely objective when it comes to stuff like that anyway. What I did was give you what each game brings to the table, and I'm going to let you decide for yourself which one you think is better. However, these two games are ridiculously similar, more than any other two games in the series. I'm honestly baffled that Nintendo didn't get more backlash for this, because in my eyes, Tears of the Kingdom is one of the laziest sequels ever made. I see it pretty much the same as the movie Hangover 2. It's a sequel, sure, but it doesn't really add anything to the first movie. It's not some additional content to expand on the first movie's narrative, aka it's not a DLC. You don't really need to have seen the first one to understand what is happening. It's basically a retelling of the first one, changing a few things here and there, and feels incredibly lazy for that reason. It barely feels like a sequel at all. I can think of maybe 4 moments where Tears of the Kingdom felt like a sequel. At the beginning, when Zelda mentioned the Calamity. In this memory, when Zelda talked about Link helping her defeat a great evil. This tomb here serving as a memorial for the people who lost their lives during the Calamity, and from Master Koga. That's it. The Calamity is mentioned here and there from time to time, but not much more than that. I don't really think it's the case, but sometimes I feel like they try to make us forget about Breath of the Wild. There's so many questions left unanswered after playing the game. If this is really a sequel, can we know what happened to the Divine Beasts? What happened to the Guardians? What about the previous shrines? Was the Ganondorf beneath Hyrule Castle the cause of the Great Calamity? Are they the same entity? How many years have passed since Breath of the Wild? None of these things are mentioned at all in the game, except that one time when Narito talked about Vah Medoh's Perch, which is part of a shrine quest that you don't even need to do to find its shrine. Very few people even recognize you at all. It's almost like they forgot about what you did in the first game. I mean, look at this. Have you ever been to my shop? Yeah, I brought you here, you dumbass. I guess it's not that surprising that the random jabronis don't recognize you, since nobody was really there to see you do everything you did, but still, you helped 4 out of the 5 major Hyrule races. Your story could have been a legend that spread across the land. Maybe some people could not believe your story, maybe some will literally faint when they see you. Like, there was quite the potential there, but instead we have maybe 15 people who really remember you and way fewer who seem legitimately excited to see you again. Even outside of its role as a supposed sequel, Tears of the Kingdom is disappointing in so many other areas. As I've alluded at the start of this video, the game is not remotely close to being 6 years better than Breath of the Wild. This is the biggest case of copy and paste from one game to another the series has ever seen, and it's not even close. The combat, game structure, general overworld, collectibles, and debatably plot are pulled straight from Breath of the Wild with very few adjustments. No real new weapon style has been added, very few new enemies that aren't that fun to fight were added as well, the dungeons function the same, 90% of the armors you find in the game was stuff that already existed. The story is told in the same manner with memories, the tutorial is pretty much the same. The only real new game changer is the Ultrahand ability, which at this point is probably what's going to determine if you prefer this game or not. I've seen basically everywhere that this vehicle building mechanic is the best part of the game, and I can understand why it would be fun for some players, but I never expected the average Zelda fan to like it that much, as it doesn't feel very Zelda. However, I'm a firm believer that different does not equal bad. Problem is, this Ultrahand mechanic is implemented like garbage. For one, Tears of the Kingdom never pushes this mechanic to its full potential. Nintendo never asks you to be creative with the mechanic. Whenever you need to build anything for any reason, whether it's for the main quest or any side quest, the game will provide you with every single Zonai part you would possibly need. I understand why they would do that in shrines, but I do think that the crystal shrines would have been more interesting, especially the ones in the sky, if Zonai parts weren't given to you for free every time and you had to come up with your own solutions for each one. Also, I might be the only one with this opinion, but I do think seeing Zonai parts just hanging around everywhere on the surface like that feels way too immersion breaking. It looks way too video gamey for me and just takes me out of the experience. Anyway, let's explore the mechanic in details now. The very first thing I noticed about it is how incredibly janky and unreliable it is. It's harder than it should to place something where you want it to go, and seeing misaligned stuff all the time triggers the OCD in me. Building stuff also takes way too long, and for what? Creating vehicles that don't even work half the time and break on you when you try to activate them? What's the point? I'm also shocked people haven't mentioned this more, but the vehicles control like fucking shit. It's something that's pretty hard to understand if you haven't played it, but they can barely turn. You also have no control over the speed of what you create, outside of stuff specifically using wheels on the ground, and that obviously comes with its problems. Vehicles can feel way too fast and uncontrollable on the surface, and way too slow when flying in the sky. This feature is really only fun for building wacky stuff, or if you have a TikTok or YouTube account on which you want to post funny clips. Otherwise, it almost never feels worth dabbling with due to how janky it is. You're going to use it for puzzles and shrines, and in the sky to go from island to island, and that's it really. If you wanted to build a car or something, by the time you build it, ride it, hopefully have enough batteries to reach your destination, and God forbid you don't run into any rock or tree along the way, you'd probably be better off just going on foot. At that point, I'd much rather use a horse or even the Master Cycle Zero from Breath of the Wild, but since there's no more ancient saddle to teleport your horse to wherever you are, horses are back to being dog shit like they were in that game before its DLCs. I already know what you're thinking right now, but there's the Autobuild ability which solves the jankiness of Ultrahand. Once you've built something just once, you can save it and then build it later. This is true, but it's not without its problems. It does save you a little bit from the jankiness of building stuff over and over, at the downside of making you spend even more time in menus. Let's say for example that you want to build yourself a plane, which to keep it simple takes 3 fans, 1 wing, 1 board with wheels, and 1 steering stick. Those are part of the Zonai devices you get from the gacha machines. What you need to do is go on the Zonai devices page in the menu, select and drop the devices you need, select the auto build ability, select the vehicle you want to make, and then you can assemble it. I wouldn't call this a fast process, but it's definitely faster than using Ultrahand. You're probably thinking again, but Autobuild lets you create the Zonai devices using Zonaite, which is again correct, but again has its issues. The first one being you can't use large Zonaite for Autobuild. You absolutely need to use regular Zonaite. The second one is that if you really think about it, using Zonaite isn't practical most of the time. Zonaite can be used for other stuff than just auto-build, such as trading them for crystallized chargers or be sold for money. The Zonaite devices only use in the game is for building vehicles. You can't sell them or trade them for anything, so you might as well use them every time you can. Yes, you can fuse them to your weapons, but you can do that with anything, so it's not really a unique feature. You could also make the argument that obtaining the Zonai devices you need is a lot easier and faster than obtaining enough Zonai to replace them. Reaching and using the gacha machines is a lot simpler than going in the depths to farm enough Zonite. However, what Autobuild lets you do with Zonite is replicate the wooden or concrete planks or the huge floating platforms or any other piece of construction that isn't a Zonite device, which is cool in theory, but in practice, they usually cost way more Zonite than normal devices to create. However, none of this matters because there's only one vehicle that you're ever going to need, and if you've been around the internet since the release of Tears of the Kingdom, you already know what it is. I'm of course talking about whatever variation you prefer of the double fan plus steering stick combo. For one, it costs very few resources to make, no matter how you do it. It also consumes a pretty low amount of battery life to use. No other vehicle in the game matters. It legitimately does everything you need and more. One thing you need to know is that outside of your battery life, some of the Zonite devices have a limited use time. Wings and hot air balloons just disappear after a certain time of being used. That's not the case for fans or steering sticks. They will never disappear even if you spend 10 hours in the air using them. This one vehicle is so broken and so easy to make that I really wonder how Nintendo didn't realize how much it completely breaks the game. Fortunately, you can't just build any vehicle you want in shrines, but you sure can in the dungeons though. Vehicle building almost completely invalidates the point of the Fire Temple, as you can just fly to any of the terminals and activate them. You're even taught before entering the dungeon that you can shoot Yunobo from a flying vehicle, so you can probably just fly to every terminal and finish the dungeon in less than 5 minutes. The other dungeons aren't as broken by it as this one. In the case of the Water Temple, there's barely anything to break anyway, but it's still ridiculous how much of the game is just shattered by this thing. As I explained earlier, what made the depths fun to explore for the most part was the challenge of traversing the area in the dark. You had to manage your stamina pretty well and use your resources intelligently. But if you just attach a light source on your magical infinite Segway, then exploring the depths just becomes a formality. You reduce the challenge to 0 and just hop from light route to light route without really feeling or remembering anything about the experience. I'm glad I didn't think about using vehicles to explore the depths almost at all because I feel like it would have ruined my experience almost completely. This is just one of the many ways Tears of the Kingdom can be broken open completely. When I went through the dungeons, I knew I had to give myself some limitations, otherwise I would just find them boring and easy. I played them with only one stamina bar, no bonus sage ability, no armor upgrades, and used no other Zonai devices than the ones given to me in the dungeon. My thoughts on those dungeons in the review were based on those limitations. Even outside of dungeons, the game can be broken in so many different ways that are just baffling to me. Did you know that those big targets in shrines, which would normally require you to launch an object at them, can just be activated by throwing a bomb arrow? How the fuck did that get past the testing stage? I've seen people defend this, by the way, saying it's cool how shrines have different solutions. Well, if you're just mindlessly throwing a bomb arrow at every big switch you see because you can be bothered to try, are you really enjoying the shrines? Oh, and those mirrors that require light to be reflected at them? Yeah, just shooting dazzle fruits at them also works. I mean, why wouldn't it, right? As you might expect, you can't take out Zonai devices from your inventory in shrines. And that's a good thing, right? They wouldn't want you to just rock it up to skip whole shrines. But what I didn't tell you is that you can still fuse a rocket to your shield before entering the shrine, and then use it in the shrine to skip it completely. In fact, Beard Bear made a video not too long ago showing 61 shrines that can be skipped completely using various methods. Now, some of these strats are super cool and something that regular players are never going to pull off, but some of them are just a joke to skip. Not to mention the various other ways you can cheese the shrines via abusing Ultrahand, Recall, and possibly Ascend, most likely in that order. You can probably figure them out by yourself too. I did try to complete each one as intended when playing, except one, the right roll. That one's final puzzle can fuck off. Of course, I'm cherry picking the shrines here, I'll be the first one to admit it, but this overall lack of polish just disturbs me. Nintendo apparently decided to delay Tears of the Kingdom for an extra year, and their reason given was that they wanted to finish polishing it. I really would have liked to see what it looked like back then because it is far from a polished game. While in comparison to most modern games, which are almost unplayable on release, Tears is very polished, but it's still improvable in so many areas. To be clear, I'm not talking about the performances of the game, or the Switch, even though it's pretty obvious at this point that a console less powerful than my toaster is not very good for 2023, but it's something we already know about. It still runs better than Breath of the Wild, but I have that game on the Wii U, so it's not really a comparison you should be too proud of from my perspective. One bug I got a couple of times that was also present in Breath of the Wild was the multiple random blood moons. This was a bug that was known for years that they didn't even bother to fix when making the sequel. There's even a way that was discovered to manually trigger a blood moon on command. So much for polishing the game for a whole year. On the bright side, Nintendo's lack of care did also bring some positives. I was eventually able to find a way to make combat fun for myself. You see, I didn't update my game past 1.1.1, so I still have access to all of the most important glitches on my Switch. Just to try it out, I ended up doing the glitch to transfer the Unbreakable Master Sword from the beginning of the game to my current save file. This weapon fixes so many issues I had with the combat. The most ironic part about this is, I did this glitch after I wrote the combat section of this video. I wasn't even aware of the glitch at that time. I didn't know that the Unbreakable Master Sword was unable to be fused with anything, which is, I think, a perfect balancing design for an unbreakable weapon. I mean, I know that you can do that with another glitch, but I didn't think it was necessary. Another thing I learned later on is that the Master Sword in this game can shoot beams even when not at full health, but only if you're wearing either of the Champion's Leathers or the Tunic of Memories. Why is that? I don't fucking know, but it means you can use the sword for ranged attacks without using a bow. So, with that knowledge, I decided to try to take down a Gleeok with only Master Sword beams, and I succeeded! It took a while and it was pretty rough, but it was absolutely one of my favorite moments playing this game. It really sucks that I had to glitch the game to make combat fun for myself though. It's also not the only glitch I ended up abusing. I duplicated so many objects during my playthrough. They changed the dragons to make them as annoying as possible to farm. They don't have reliable spawn points like they used to in Breath of the Wild. Now they're always on the same path, but you can only collect a piece of them every 10 minutes in real time. Why did they change that? I really have no clue, but I'm not going to waste my time farming these or Zonaite forever, that's for sure. The last issues I had revolve around the story, and mainly how it's told. The memories I think worked well in Breath of the Wild, since the story wasn't really too grandiose, and it was more about the characters than the actual plot. They didn't need to be viewed in any particular order, and they didn't spoil anything in the game. They simply do not work for Tears of the Kingdom's story structure, however. Aside from the surprise cameos of the game's shrines in some of them, which obviously makes no sense at all narratively, The Tears memories can spoil you one of the bigger story elements of the plot. And by one of the bigger elements, I mean the focal reason as to why this story exists in the first place. Your main goal in this game, the main quest that doesn't get completed until you defeat the final boss, is find Princess Zelda. The reason why you visit the 4 villages again this time is because there have been sightings of Zelda in those areas. The regional phenomenon happening in these areas is not even the main reason as to why you're visiting them. Link is just a simp looking for his queen. You do see Zelda here and there throughout the main quest, just popping up and disappearing. That Zelda was the fake one created by Ganondorf, something you learn at the Hyrule Castle encounter. In fact, she is the one that causes all of the regional problems in the 4 villages. Yeah, that gets completely spoiled in one of the memories. What a joke! Also, if you go through all of the memories before doing any of the main quest, you do end up finding Princess Zelda. You know where she is, so why doesn't Link say anything about it to anyone? Seriously, he doesn't say a thing to anybody about it until Purah tells you to find the Master Sword. If you have it before doing any of the dungeons, Link doesn't say anything to any of the residents of those villages or anybody at Lookout Landing until Purah's like, oh yeah, you should go look for the Master Sword, which is after the Hyrule Castle encounter. Even when you find it, Link only says it was on the head of a giant dragon. The more you progress in this game, the more Lookout Landing fills itself up with people who are basically there to help you find Zelda. Tell me, what is their purpose here if you already know where she is? Am I the only one who thinks this is just weird? Am I crazy? Link just seems like a huge asshole here. Talk about character assassination of someone who barely has any character at all. Oh, and on that topic, even though I do think the plot of the game is better than the one of Breath of the Wild, I think its characters are worse. For one, all of the old sages from the past era are basically the same. They all tell you about the Imprisoning War, which are the events of how Ganondorf ended up sealed during the after dungeon cutscene in the exact same way. I don't even think they said their name in those cutscenes. Not that it matters really, because they have zero personality. The new sages are better, but only because you know them already. All of them seem unrecognizable from Breath of the Wild. Sidon's a big pussy now, Riju and Yunobo have the personality of potatoes, and Teba's not even a sage now, his son is, who is probably the most interesting one, and I've dunked on the last one already enough. I don't have anything else to say about her anymore. When it comes to the plot points I mentioned regarding Link staying silent, there was definitely a way to solve the issues. How do I know this? Because it's something they already did in Breath of the Wild. Remember when people were talking to you about the Master Sword across the different stables and villages? If you already had the sword, then you would get a different dialogue than if you didn't. There's even a side quest based on that. Why couldn't Link just say to others upon seeing the fake Zelda that it's not the real one? It would have gone a long way to fix this and really wouldn't change anything to the story. They would still want to solve their respective problems and ask you to help them. Also, simply updating Purah after you see the final tier memory about this whole situation, if you talk to her again, would have been perfect. She can still tell you to go get the Master Sword after this. It doesn't need to be after the Hyrule Castle encounter. You don't even need to change anything about the encounter. That part can stay the same. Ganondorf doesn't know that you know that this is a fake Zelda, so it would still work. I know this seems like a nitpick, which it might be, but most of the issues I have with this game are pretty much just little things like that which add up quickly. There is so much stuff I can talk about that seems like small, little, insignificant details to the people who haven't really played the game, but that you really feel when you're actually playing it. The biggest one being how much it loves to waste your time. Everything just takes forever to do. Take for example the paraglider. Why do you have to go through so many extra steps for something so important? It could take you hours to get it on your first playthrough, and it was given to you for free in Breath of the Wild. You couldn't even miss it if you tried. There's a travel medallion in the game, which was a great DLC feature in Breath of the Wild, but is now in the base game. However, you need to first obtain it in the Akala Ancient Tech Lab located in the middle of Assville. The best part is, it's not even functional when you get it. You need to go back to see Robbie in Lookout Landing to activate it. The next best part is, there is no fast travel back to that lab anymore. So if you weren't done with your exploration, you can't even drop the medallion here and come back later. As I've mentioned already, building stuff takes forever and vehicles are way too annoying to control. Autobuild, which does help the game overall despite its flaws, can take ages to obtain and feels like something you should be nudged towards earlier into the game. You eventually get a quest for it, but you need to complete at least one of the 4 main dungeons for it to become available. Obtaining the radar features also takes way too long. You have to go through a bunch of quests, including getting Autobuild, just to unlock the basic shrine detector, which was also something that was given to you for free in Breath of the Wild. It's also a lot less useful in this game too, since light routes now tell you where shrines are, so there's no reason as to why it should take this long to get. It's a similar case for the camera, needing to go through a bunch of quests to get it, but since it's just the camera, I think it's acceptable. Unlike Breath of the Wild, you have to go through long, uninteresting quests to get access to the Great Fairies to upgrade your gear, involving building vehicles and attaching them to your horse and stuff. Upgrading your gear also feels a lot more expensive this time around, whether it's with money or monster parts. In fact, the game is a lot more grindy than Breath of the Wild. In that game, you really only needed stuff for cooking or to upgrade your armor / inventory space. But now, you need stuff for those, but also fusing with your weapons, arrows, and shields, breaking the many walls of rocks in various caves, obtaining zonai devices, selling stuff for money, upgrading your battery life, etc. There are also many types of currency in the game. You have rupees, korok seeds, zonaite, large zonaite, crystallized charges, post souls, booble gems, pony points, zonite charges, sage's will, and grinding all of those can take a long ass time. If you're someone who enjoys grinding for stuff like that, good for you, but I'll just keep duping what I need because I still can and you won't stop me. The worst case of extra padding in the game, however, is related to the Hylian hood. Do you have any idea how many steps you need to go through just to be able to put it down? Seeing how Link with his hood down was a look that was promoted a lot before the release of the game, they even made an amiibo of it, you would think that it would be easy to accomplish, right? Someone expecting the game to be reasonable might just think it'd be an option in the menu, but no! If you've been paying attention, you should know by now that nothing is simple in Tears of the Kingdom. You need to go to Hateno Village, complete the 5 side quests surrounding the mayoral election, and then talk to Cece while wearing the Hylian hood. Only then will she suggest you to put it down, which you can then accept to do. Oh, and by the way, if you want to wear the hood up again, you still don't have that option in the menu. You need to talk to Cece again. Who thought this was a good idea? That person needs to be fired. There is a solution to this, which is very dumb, but still the only way you can swap between the two looks at any time you want. If you buy a second Hylian hood, it will stay up on your head when wearing it by default. Of course, you're going to have to upgrade this new hood to the Great Fairies, which is just fantastic. Last point I want to mention, and this might just be a personal issue, but it took so long for me to get used to the controls. I've never had any issues with controls in any game I can recall, but there's just something about this game that feels off, especially in regards to the menus and abilities. Even after 100 hours of gameplay, I still get stuff mixed up sometimes, and I just don't understand why. Am I the only one who's had these issues? Please let me know. I know I sounded negative in this review, especially in the later third of it. However, I did like the game overall, which is why I ended up playing it all the way through, and then again for this video, doing all the extra stuff that I did. And there are things that I did prefer in Tears compared to Breath of the Wild. The biggest one, of course, is the story being overall more interesting. The dungeons are also probably a bit better overall. Even though I really like the mechanic of moving parts of the Divine Beasts, the new temples feel much more unique, and I had to use more brain power to solve them. The bosses are for sure better, that's a given. The Blight fights were pretty mediocre. The side quests were definitely an improvement. The new abilities are really cool. I also thought the depths were pretty sweet at first, and I really appreciate how its exploration helped out the exploration on the surface level and vice versa. I like that there's a way to get all the different amiibo outfits this time around, even though I don't think they're really useful. There were cool ideas overall in this game. The low gravity mechanic was fun. The sky was a good idea in theory, and the engine is still a really good one. Even though I have my issues with the controls when it comes to stuff like the menus, Link himself has never controlled better, and the sound quality has really been improved. I mentioned so many little gripes I had with Tears of the Kingdom, so it's only fair that I now point out the little things it improved on from Breath of the Wild. For one, if you get new gear from a treasure chest when your inventory is full, you don't need to close the chest, find a weapon to drop in your inventory, and then open the chest again. You get the option to swap it for another one right away. Star fragments appear way more often than they used to, thank God for that. And blood moons are also a lot more frequent, which also makes sense thematically. I also like how there's only one time of day puzzle bullshit for a shrine quest this time. Those were just awful. There are also no shrines based around motion controls in this one, which I'm sure nobody is going to complain about. Finally, even though I'm not really a graphics guy, I'll give credit where credit is due and say that the visuals were noticeably better. I appreciate all of these changes for sure. In conclusion, even if I think Tears of the Kingdom is a good game, it just overall feels like it was stapled together without any real vision. They took basically any ideas people had and just threw them into the game without thinking if it really needed it. Alright, let me give you a visual example of what I mean when I say this. So, let's take Breath of the Wild. It's a very solid game, it's a bit rough around the edges, it's got some flaws, some noticeable flaws here and there, but overall it remains coherent and it feels great to play. Now let's take Breath of the Wild, and let's add in the depths. So, the depths definitely have a lower amount of content compared to the surface. It's about half the content, probably even less, it's debatable, but it still feels decently connected to the surface because of, the light routes are where the shrines are on the surface, the abandoned mines are roughly where the major villages are, so there was clearly some thought put into it, but it just feels a bit off. So, you add to that the sky. So the sky has the lowest amount of content out of the three by far. It's attached to the surface kinda, but not really. The surface is really only there to help you get to the sky, and that's about it. But it still feels also somewhat connected to the depths because you can find Sundelions that help you explore the depths in there. You can find the old maps. in which you get the rewards in the depths. So, you know, there's some coherence here and there, but it feels like the most disconnected part out of this whole thing. But even more disconnected than all of those is the Ultrahand ability. You know, Ultrahand sometimes just feels like its own game. You know, it feels like it was added to Breath of the Wild, but it really didn't really need it. It was just added because why not? Like, it doesn't really help the game, but it also doesn't really hurt the game. It's just there. You barely even have to interact with it if you don't want to. It's just there. You know, it could be recycled into its own game, but it clearly has flaws that they try to correct with the last edition, Autobuild. So Autobuild, I feel like it was just added when they realized how janky Ultrahand was, or it was just added in last minute. And it, you know, it also doesn't really fit with the rest of the game, but you know, there's a somewhat a connection to the depths because you need to get Zonite to use Autobuild, and because that's where you find Autobuild. So that's pretty much it. And to add to all of these, of course, you need to add your extra 100 Koroks and extra 32 shrines, because why not, I guess. There is definitely a lack of meaningful content. So the shrines would go about here. That's probably what connects all the three together. And the Koroks would go about here. That's pretty much what the sky was for, to add extra Koroks and shrines to the surface. And yeah, that's about it. You just scratch that and rename it Tears of the Kingdom. And there you go. That's Tears of the Kingdom. So it feels like the same game with a bunch of stuff that really didn't need to be there, but they're just there. If it looks like a mess, it's pretty much because it is, but you know what? Screw it. Let's just charge 70 USD for it. It's gonna sell anyway, right? To finally answer the question, if I try to be as objective as I can, I'm going to say that Breath of the Wild is a better game than Tears of the Kingdom, even in 2023. People might answer to that by saying, but there's so much more content and so many more gameplay options. How can it not be better than Breath of the Wild? Well, in my opinion, that doesn't make a game better. The new content and new gameplay options need to be worthwhile for it to be a better game. For example, would Breath of the Wild have been a better game if it had 1200 Korok seeds instead of 900? It's technically more content, so it would make the game better by default, right? Well, I don't think so, since it's absolutely insignificant content. You could even make the argument that it would make the game worse, since you lower the average quality of its content, but I won't go that far. As far as gameplay options, I'm going to talk about a game I played for the first time ever this year, the original Resident Evil 4. Even though it's not one of my absolute favorite games, I consider it to be one of the best games I've ever played. It has barely any flaws, and the ones I have are more nitpicks than anything. For those who have played the game and enjoyed it as much as I did, would the game have been better if you could build cars in it?
Where's everyone going? Bingo?
Obviously, it's not a perfect one-to-one comparison, but you get the point. Sometimes imposing limitations on gameplay can make for a better game overall. It forces you to interact with what makes the gameplay good and prevents you from dabbling with faster and easier but lamer options. At the end of the day, what really matters is how fun a game is to play, and what makes a game feel fun to play depends a lot on its core gameplay loop. Even though I've spent hours comparing both games, and we can debate if we think some aspects are better than others between the two, these can make for good discussions. But the most important stuff to nail for a game to feel fun is the core gameplay loop. It is the soul of a game. Breath of the Wild's gameplay loop of walk and climb, look around for interesting stuff, glide, explore interesting stuff, repeat, was what made it magical and so hard to put down. Tears of the Kingdom's gameplay loop looks more like teleport to the sky, look around for interesting stuff, glide, walk and climb, explore interesting stuff, repeat. Even though the mechanics are the same in both games and the overall structure seems the same, it is night and day in terms of experience. In Breath of the Wild, the looking for interesting stuff part came after the walk and climb part. The latter was the reward for the former. When you climbed something, you didn't know what was on the other side, making it interesting and inviting to just try stuff out. It was a little challenge that ended up being rewarded. In Tears of the Kingdom, you can just warp up to the sky at any point. So most of the time when you start climbing or walking somewhere, you already know what you're looking for, which makes it feel more like a nuisance than anything. It may not seem like much, but it makes all the difference in the world when you're playing. If you've ever felt like something was a little bit off while playing, like you weren't really having that much fun exploring, more exhausting than inviting, that's the reason why. It's not because Tears reuses the same map as Breath of the Wild, it's because the best and most efficient options for traversing it are boring. Since everything important is so easily visible, there's no real sense of discovery when exploring. Shrines are visible from the sky, so are towers, memory locations are indicated with huge drawings. In Breath of the Wild, you are expected to find those on your own. Even caves can be shown to you by giving a fruit to the Satori at any cherry blossom tree, and there's one for every region. You might be telling yourself, if warping up in the sky ruins the feeling of exploration for you, then don't warp up in the sky when exploring the surface, duh. Well, let me ask you this then. Why wouldn't I warp up in the sky? I mean, I can, and it's the most efficient way to traverse the world, so why would I not do it? This is what I mean when I say sometimes imposing limitations on gameplay can make for a better experience. You might also say that you can circumvent the climbing by building a vehicle, but we already went into all of the problems with that, and in the end, climbing is what consumes the least amount of resources, so you might as well just climb up there anyway. The last question I can ask myself is there a way to fix Tears of the Kingdom? What would I personally change in it? Well, I really don't know. I mean, look at this thing. How do you even start fixing something like this? I would really have to think about it for a long time. I do have some obvious ideas on how to fix stuff off the top of my head, but not for everything. Nintendo announced recently that they have no plans for a Tears of the Kingdom DLC, so my hopes of seeing the issues I have being addressed are looking pretty grim. What I do know is that if they make a third game like this in the same map, on the same engine and everything, I'm not going to buy it. Anyway, what do you guys think? Am I crazy for all of my takes? I've seen more people pointing out Tears of the Kingdom's flaws than I thought I would, but almost nobody seems to think that Breath of the Wild was better like I do. Some criticism I've gotten is, it's because you've played Breath of the Wild first. That's why you prefer it, which you can now hopefully see that it's not the case. For those of you who agree with me, what would you change about the game? Whatever your thoughts, leave a comment. I will read it. And thanks everyone for watching.